When Ceres tasted the blood pooling in her mouth, she knew only the human mercenary could save her now from the torture chamber deep in Zorgon territory. The abusive reptilian guards had left her broken and brutalized, a political pawn in a twisted game, but human tenacity was her last hope. Tensions between the Lurian Republic and Zorgon Empire had reached a breaking point. Zorgon raiders ambushed a Lurian diplomatic transport, capturing Ceres, the daughter of a prominent Lurian senator. The fragile truce teetered on a knife's edge. One wrong move could ignite a devastating interstellar war that would consume countless worlds. In a desperate gambit, the Lurian Galactic Council turned to outside help. Matthew Scott, a grizzled human mercenary with a reputation for doing the impossible. They tasked him with an urgent rescue operation, despite the mission's grim odds. Matthew knew the stakes as he reviewed the intel. The Zorgons were infamous for their cruelty, and time was Ceres' greatest enemy. Every hour she remained in their clutches dimmed her chances of survival. But Matthew had stared down death before. This was his element. He infiltrated the Zorgon outpost on Grixos, a seedy jungle world beyond Lurian jurisdiction. Slicing through layers of security with practiced efficiency, he breached the compound's inner sanctum. Heavily armed Zorgon enforcers swarmed to stop him. The dim corridors erupted in a storm of weapons fire. Bullets ripped through the air as Matthew dove between cover, returning fire with lethal precision. The disciplined human warfare style clashed against the Zorgon's chaotic frontal assaults. When the shooting stopped, Zorgon bodies littered the ground. Matthew hacked into the cell block's control system and located Ceres. He found her curled in the corner of a filthy cell, shivering and hollow-eyed. Her captivity had left its mark. "I'm here to take you home," Matthew said, offering a hand. Ceres recoiled, mistrust written on her azure features, but as alarms began to blare, she realized this human was her only way out. Together, they raced through the compound as Zorgon reinforcements closed in. Matthew dispatched their pursuers with ruthless efficiency, his superior combat reflexes overpowering the alien soldiers. He commandeered an idling Zorgon transport and gunned the engines. They blasted off-world moments before the Zorgons could mobilize to stop them. As the battered transport ship limped through Lurian space, an uneasy silence stretched between Matthew and Ceres. She studied her alien rescuer with a mix of fear and newfound respect. Maybe humans weren't the uncaring brutes Lurian propaganda made them out to be. Maybe there was more to their story. Without the humans' intervention, Ceres knew she would be dead, or worse. As their unlikely partnership propelled them into an uncertain future, one truth crystallized in her mind. Only the tenacity of this human mercenary had saved her from a fate worse than death. For better or worse, their destinies were now intertwined, as the repercussions of her rescue began to unfold. As the battered transport touched down on the Lurian homeworld, a sense of relief washed over Ceres. She was home, safe. But as Matthew helped her down the ramp, she noticed the grim faces of the Lurian officials waiting to greet them. In the briefing room, the Lurian leaders laid out the disturbing facts. Zorgon ships were amassing near the border, their numbers far exceeding anything the Lurians had anticipated. Ceres' rescue had seemingly pushed the Zorgons over the edge. Invasion was imminent. Matthew leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. This wasn't his fight. He'd done what they asked, gotten the girl back in one piece. It was time to collect his credits and move on to the next job. Let the Lurians clean up their own mess. But as he glanced at Ceres, seeing the fear in her eyes, something stirred within him. She'd been through hell, and it was because of him that she'd made it out alive. Could he really just walk away now, knowing what the Zorgons had in store for her people? He met the eyes of the Lurian commander. "I might have an idea, but you're not going to like it." Matthew outlined his plan. A preemptive strike on the Zorgons' main shipyard. Take out their invasion fleet before it even left the ground. It was bold, risky, and more than a little insane. Just the way he liked it. The Lurians argued back and forth, their voices rising. Too dangerous, too provocative. It would only make things worse. But Matthew held his ground. They could sit back and wait for the Zorgons to come knocking, or they could take the fight to the enemy, hit them where it hurt. In the end, perhaps seeing no other options, they reluctantly agreed. Matthew would lead a small team of his best mercs to infiltrate the shipyard and sabotage the fleet. A covert operation with no official Lurian involvement. Plausible deniability. As the meeting broke up, Ceres cornered Matthew in the hallway. "I'm coming with you." Matthew shook his head. "No way. You barely made it out last time. I'm not putting you in danger again." Ceres squared her shoulders, her expression defiant. "I know the Zorgon systems. I can get you inside. This is my fight too." They stared each other down for a long moment. Matthew saw the drive in her eyes, the fire that even Zorgon torture couldn't extinguish. Maybe she was tougher than he'd given her credit for. "Fine," he relented, "but you follow my lead. And if things go south, you get the hell out. No heroics." As he assembled his team and prepped his gear, Matthew tried to ignore the growing unease in his gut. This was bigger than anything he'd signed on for, the fate of an entire species in his hands. One wrong move, and they were all screwed. That night, as he cleaned his rifle, Ceres slipped into his quarters. In the dim light, her blue skin seemed to glow. "I never thanked you," she said softly, "for coming for me. You saved my life." Matthew grunted, not meeting her gaze. "Just doing my job." She touched his arm, her slender fingers cool against his skin. "You're more than just a mercenary. You're a good man." He looked at her then, this alien girl who'd somehow gotten under his skin. "I'll keep you safe, Ceres. Whatever it takes. I promise." In the pre-dawn darkness, they boarded their ships, the ragtag fleet of human vessels, an odd sight amongst the sleek Lurian crafts. Matthew felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as the engines roared to life. This was it. No turning back. As they broke atmosphere and pointed their ships towards Zorgon space, Matthew knew they were heading into the lion's den. But this was the only way. The Lurians were counting on them. Ceres was counting on him. And he'd be damned if he let any of them down. Even if he had to take on the whole Zorgon Empire himself, he'd see this through, one way or another. The fleet of human vessels dropped out of FTL on the edge of Zorgon space. Matthew's voice crackled over the comms. "All right, team, this is it. Mask your signatures and proceed to target." Ceres sat beside him in the cockpit, her fingers flying over the alien controls. "Jamming frequencies engaged. We're invisible to their sensors." The shipyard loomed ahead, a sprawling structure of metal and light. Matthew's grip tightened on the controls. "All ships, weapons hot. On my mark. Fire." A barrage of missiles and energy beams lanced out, catching the Zorgons completely off guard. Explosions bloomed across the shipyard's surface as alarms blared. "Boarding team, move in," Matthew ordered. Their ship latched onto the main platform with a metallic thunk. He turned to Ceres. "Stay close." They burst from the airlock, guns blazing. Zorgon defenders swarmed towards them, but the humans cut them down with practiced efficiency. Matthew's rifle spat death, each shot finding its mark. Ceres ducked behind cover, pulling out a data pad. "I'm in their network, shutting down internal defenses. Now!" The facility's lights flickered and died. Blast doors slammed shut, trapping Zorgon reinforcements. "Good work," Matthew nodded. "Let's move." They fought their way deeper, planting charges on half-built warships. But as they neared their extraction point, a hail of plasma fire erupted from a side corridor. "Ambush!" one of Matthew's men shouted before a bolt caught him in the chest. They dove for cover as Zorgon troops poured in, cutting off their escape. Matthew's mind raced. The charges had to be detonated, or this was all for nothing. He made his decision. "Everyone fall back to the ship. I'll set them off manually." Ceres grabbed his arm. "No! There has to be another way." Matthew met her eyes. "There isn't. Go, that's an order." His team hesitated, but another volley of fire forced them back. Ceres looked at him one last time before following the others. Matthew turned to face the oncoming Zorgons. He fired, moved, reloaded, bodies piled up, but still they came. When his rifle finally clicked empty, He pulled the detonator from his belt. The Zorgons realized what he held and charged. Matthew smiled. "See you in hell." He pressed the button. The shipyard erupted in a cataclysm of fire and twisted metal. On their retreating vessels, Ceres watched the inferno through tear-filled eyes. Days later, she stood before the Lurian Council as they heaped praise upon her. But she felt nothing. The war was averted, but at what cost? That night, she gazed at the stars, remembering Matthew's promise to keep her safe. "I'll make it count," she whispered. "I swear." Post-credit scene. Debris drifted in the void where the shipyard once stood. Among the wreckage, a battered escape pod tumbled end over end. Inside, a bloody hand twitched. Matthew Scott's eyes fluttered open. The Lurian capital erupted in a cacophony of cheers as the surviving members of Matthew's strike team touched down. Crowds thronged the streets, their azure skin shimmering under the twin suns. Banners fluttered in the breeze, proclaiming victory over the Zorgon threat. Ceres stood on the balcony of the Grand Assembly, watching the celebrations below. Her chest felt hollow, each breath a struggle. She forced a smile as a Lurian official pinned a medal to her chest, but her eyes remained distant. "You've saved us all," the official beamed. "The Zorgon fleet is crippled. We're safe because of you." Ceres nodded mechanically, her mind replaying those final moments on the shipyard. The look in Matthew's eyes as he ordered them to leave, the explosion that followed. Later, she slipped away from the festivities, finding solace in the quiet of her quarters. She sank onto her bed, clutching a small hollow projector. With trembling fingers, she activated it. Matthew's face flickered to life, a recording from their journey back to Lurian space. "Hey, kid," his gruff voice filled the room. "If you're watching this, well, I guess things didn't go according to plan." Ceres felt tears welling up as she watched, Matthew's words washing over her. Meanwhile, deep in the void of space, emergency klaxons blared inside a battered escape pod. Matthew Scott's eyes snapped open, his body racked with pain. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead as he struggled to focus. The pod's systems flickered and sputtered around him. Matthew dragged himself to the control panel, every movement agony. His fingers fumbled over the keys, activating the distress beacon. "Mayday," he rasped into the comm. "This is Matthew Scott. Need immediate evac?" The message looped, a faint cry in the vastness of space. Matthew slumped back, consciousness fading. The pod drifted, tumbling end over end amidst the debris of the destroyed shipyard. Days passed. A sleek vessel cut through the starry expanse, its hull adorned with burn marks and patchwork repairs. On the bridge, a man with a scarred face leaned forward, studying the wreckage on his view screen. "Captain Varro," a crewman called out. "We're picking up a signal. Looks like a distress beacon." Cade Varro's eyes narrowed. "Source?" "Escape pod lodged in the debris field." Cade stroked his chin, considering. "Bring us in closer. Could be salvage or survivors with information to sell." As they approached, Cade's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the pod's design, human-made. "Get a tractor beam on that thing," he barked. "I want it in our hangar now." The crew scrambled to comply. Minutes later, Cade stood before the battered pod as its hatch hissed open. His eyes widened as he saw the figure inside. "Well, I'll be damned," Cade muttered. "Matthew fucking Scott." He reached in, checking for a pulse. Weak, but there. "Get him to medbay," Cade ordered. "And keep this quiet. No one knows he's here but us." As his men carried Matthew's unconscious form away, Cade's mind raced. It had been years since they'd last crossed paths, since the job that had torn their partnership apart. Now fate had delivered Matthew right into his hands. Cade smiled, a predatory glint in his eye. Whatever his old friend had gotten mixed up in, it was bound to be profitable, one way or another. The stealth ship's sensors blared to life, startling Ceres from her vigil at the command console. Red lights flashed across the displays as a swarm of hostile signatures materialized from the void. "We've got company!" she shouted, her fingers flying across the controls. Multiple vessels heavily armed. They're on an intercept course. The Lurian crew scrambled to battle stations as the first volley of enemy fire streaked past their hull. Ceres gritted her teeth, executing a series of evasive maneuvers that sent the ship into a wild spin. "It's Cade Vero," the tactical officer reported, his voice tight with tension. "We've ID'd his flagship. They must have tracked us somehow." Ceres cursed under her breath. She'd heard stories of the notorious pirate captain, but never expected to face him in combat. As she wrestled with the controls, her mind raced. They were searching for Matthew. Could Vero have found him first? The ship rocked violently as a plasma bolt found its mark. Alarms screamed throughout the vessel as systems began to fail. "We can't take much more of this," the chief engineer shouted over the comm. "Shields are at 30% and dropping." Ceres' hands tightened on the controls. "All hands, prepare to repel boarders. We're not going down without a fight." The words had barely left her mouth when the hull reverberated with the distinctive thunk of grappling hooks. Ceres abandoned the helm, snatching up a plasma rifle as she raced to join the defense. She found herself shoulder to shoulder with Lurian soldiers, their azure skin gleaming with sweat as they took up positions around the airlock. The metal groaned, and sparks flew as the pirates began cutting through. With a thunderous boom, the airlock blew inward. Ceres didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger, her weapon spitting bolts of superheated plasma into the smoke-filled breach. Pirate boarders stumbled through, only to be cut down by the defenders' concentrated fire. But for every pirate that fell, 2 more took their place. Ceres ducked behind a bulkhead, plasma bolts sizzling past her head. She popped out to return fire, her shots finding their marks with surprising accuracy. The hours she'd spent in the combat simulator after Matthew's apparent death were paying off. A Lurian soldier beside her cried out, clutching a smoking wound in his chest. Ceres dragged him to safety, applying a pressure patch even as she continued to fire one-handed. "We can't hold them!" another soldier shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Ceres felt her heart sink. They were outgunned and outnumbered. It was only a matter of time before... A deafening explosion rocked the ship, but this time from outside. Through the breach in the hull, Ceres caught a glimpse of space beyond, and her eyes widened in disbelief. A small fighter craft screamed past, guns blazing. It executed a series of impossible maneuvers, dancing between enemy ships and leaving destruction in its wake. Ceres would recognize that flying style anywhere. "Matthew," she breathed, a smile spreading across her face. His voice crackled over the comm system. "Cavalry's here, kid. Let's show these bastards what we're made of." With renewed vigor, Ceres rallied the Lurian defenders. They pushed forward, driving the pirates back through the airlock. Outside, Matthew's stolen fighter wreaked havoc among the pirate fleet. Ceres fought her way back to the bridge, coordinating their counterattack with Matthew. His daring maneuvers drew enemy fire, allowing the Lurian ship to strike back with devastating effect. The tide of battle shifted. Pirate ships exploded in silent blooms of fire, their burning hulks drifting in the void. Matthew's piloting skills proved unmatched as he wove through the chaos, picking off targets with surgical precision. On Cade Vero's flagship, alarms blared as system after system failed. The pirate captain snarled in frustration, smacking his palm on the arm of his command chair. "All ships, fall back," he barked. "We're done here." The remnants of the pirate fleet disengaged, limping away into the depths of space. Ceres let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, sagging against the command console in relief. Minutes later, Matthew's fighter touched down in their hangar bay. Ceres raced to meet him, her heart pounding. As the cockpit opened and he climbed out, she threw herself into his arms. "I thought you were dead," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Matthew held her tight, his usual gruff demeanor softening. "Takes more than a shipyard explosion to keep me down." Their reunion was cut short by an urgent transmission from Lurian High Command. As they listened to the report, their faces grew grim. The Zorgans were mobilizing for a full-scale invasion. their fury at the shipyard's destruction driving them to unprecedented aggression. Matthew's eyes sharp. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice low. "While I was Varro's guest, I overheard some interesting chatter. The Zorgons are working on some kind of superweapon, a planet killer." Ceres felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible," she whispered. Matthew shook his head. "I wish it was. But if we don't stop them, your entire world is at risk. Hell, maybe the whole damn galaxy." Ceres stood straighter, her eyes hardening with grit. "Then we'll stop them, whatever it takes." Together, they began to formulate a plan. It was audacious, bordering on suicidal, infiltrating the Zorgon command ship to sabotage the superweapon before it could be completed. As they worked, coordinating with Lurian Command and assembling a strike team of battle-hardened mercenaries and special forces, Ceres found herself watching Matthew. The grizzled warrior who'd rescued her from Zorgon captivity had become something more. A partner, a friend, perhaps even... She pushed the thought aside. There would be time for such reflections later, if they survived. For now, they had a galaxy to save. The stealth ship cut through the void, its sleek form barely visible against the starry backdrop. Inside, Matthew Scott gripped the controls, his eyes fixed on the looming bulk of the Zorgon command vessel. "We're approaching the outer perimeter," he said, voice low. "Ceres, status on our cloaking?" Ceres' fingers danced across her console. "Holding steady. Their sensors haven't picked us up yet." Behind them, the strike team, a mix of battle-hardened human mercenaries and azure-skinned Lurian special ops, checked their weapons one last time. The air crackled with tension. As they neared the massive Zorgon ship, explosions blossomed in the distance. The distraction assault had begun. Matthew seized the opportunity, guiding their vessel towards a shadowed access port. "Breach team, ready," he ordered. The moment they docked, chaos erupted. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as Zorgon defenders poured into the corridor. Matthew ducked behind a bulkhead, returning fire with practiced precision. Beside him, Ceres moved with fluid grace, her shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy. "We need to split up," Matthew shouted over the din. "You take Alpha Team and hit the control systems. I'll lead Bravo to the reactor core." Ceres nodded, her face set with fierce concentration. They shared a brief look, a silent acknowledgement of the danger ahead, before darting off in opposite directions. Matthew led his team deeper into the bowels of the ship. The narrow corridors echoed with the sounds of battle. Zorgon warriors charged at them, mandibles clicking furiously, but the humans' superior combat training showed. They moved as one, covering each other's advances and cutting down wave after wave of alien resistance. Finally, they reached the central reactor chamber. Matthew's eyes widened at the sight of the pulsing energy core. "Plant the charges," he ordered, pulling out a handful of thermalcron detonators. "We need to—" A deafening roar cut him off. From the shadows, a massive Zorgon commander emerged, flanked by heavily armored shock troopers. Before Matthew could react, a stun blast caught him square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, consciousness fading as alien hands dragged him away. Meanwhile, Ceres and her team fought their way to the weapons control center. She slipped past the final line of defense, fingers flying over alien keyboards as she uploaded the virus. A grim smile crossed her face as the systems began to crash. Her victory was short-lived. A hail of plasma fire tore through her security team. Ceres spun, weapon raised, but found herself surrounded by Zorgon soldiers. "Surrender, human," one growled. Ceres dropped her gun, hands raised. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. But as they marched her through the ship's winding corridors, her heart sank. They were bringing her to the command deck. The doors hissed open, revealing a nightmarish scene. Matthew stood there, bruised but defiant, in the grip of Zorgon guards. And before them loomed the Supreme Warlord himself, his alien features twisted in a cruel smile. "Your pathetic attempt to stop us has failed," the Warlord boomed. He gestured to a massive view screen, where a planet hung suspended in space. Behold, the coordinates for your precious Lurian homeworld are already locked in. Soon it will be nothing but ash and ruin. Matthew strained against his captors, fury etched on his face. Ceres felt despair welling up inside her. They had come so close, only to fail at the last moment. Suddenly, the deck rocked violently. Alarms blared as the doors exploded inward. Through the smoke strode a familiar figure, Cade Varro, flanked by his motley crew of space pirates. "Sorry to crash the party," Cade drawled, leveling a massive plasma cannon at the warlord. "But I've got a proposition for you, Matthew. What say we put aside our differences and carve ourselves a piece of this Zorgan pie?" For a heartbeat, the command deck froze in stunned silence. Then all hell broke loose. Matthew seized the moment, driving an elbow into his guard's face and grabbing a fallen weapon. Ceres rolled, snatching up a Zorgan blaster and opening fire. Pirates, Zorgans, and human strike team members clashed in a frenzied melee. "The charges!" Matthew shouted to Ceres over the cacophony. "We need to reactivate them!" They fought their way back to the reactor core, Cade's pirates providing unexpected cover fire. Matthew's fingers flew over the detonator controls, bringing them back online. "It's done," he panted. "This whole place is gonna blow." Back on the command deck, Ceres threw herself at the weapon controls. Plasma bolts sizzled past her head as she worked furiously to finish corrupting the targeting systems. "Got it!" she cried triumphantly. "The super weapon's offline!" The warlord's roar of rage was drowned out by the sound of explosions rippling through the ship. Matthew grabbed Ceres' arm, dragging her towards the hangar bay. "Time to go," he shouted. They sprinted through chaos-filled corridors, dodging falling debris and battling Zorgans. The remaining members of their strike team fell in behind them, along with a handful of Cade's pirates, who had decided discretion was the better part of valor. They piled into a Zorgan shuttle, Matthew taking the controls. As they blasted out of the disintegrating flagship, the cosmos lit up with the death throes of the Zorgan superweapon. Ceres sagged in her seat, exhaustion and relief washing over her. Matthew's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "We did it, kid," he said softly. As their battered shuttle limped back to the waiting Lurian ships, Ceres knew the war was nowhere near the end. But for now, they had won the day. And sometimes, that had to be enough. The stolen Zorgan shuttle lurched as it docked with the Lurian stealth vessel. Matthew and Ceres stumbled out, exhausted but alive. Lurian medics swarmed them, tending to wounds and scanning for radiation exposure. "We did it," Ceres breathed, her voice hoarse. "But it's not over, is it?" Matthew shook his head, his face etched with weariness. "Far from it, kid. The Zorgons are wounded, but they're still out there, and they're pissed." In the war room of the Lurian flagship, Matthew stood before a holographic display of Zorgon-controlled space. His eyes scanned the pulsing red icons representing enemy strongholds and supply lines. "We need to hit them hard and fast," he said, addressing the assembled Lurian commanders. "Surgical strikes on their logistics. Cut off their ability to regroup and launch another assault on your homeworld." A Lurian admiral, his azure skin pale with fatigue, shook his head. "It's suicide, Scott. We don't have the numbers." "We don't need numbers," Matthew countered. "We need skill, speed, and a whole lot of crazy. Give me your best stealth ships and your most elite warriors. We'll make the Zorgons regret ever leaving their home system." Ceres stepped forward. "I'm going too. My knowledge of Zorgan tech could be the edge we need." As the Lurians debated, a familiar drawl cut through the tension. Cade Varro swaggered into the room, flanked by his motley crew of pirates. Now, Cade said, a predatory grin on his face. "Don't tell me you're planning a party without inviting us. We've got scores to settle with the Zorgans, and their supply depots are just begging to be liberated." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "And why should we trust you, Varro?" Cade spread his arms wide. "Because, old friend, you need every gun you can get, and nobody knows how to hit hard and fade away like we do." Hours later, a fleet of mismatched vessels slipped into hyperspace. Lurian stealth ships flew alongside refitted pirate cruisers, united in their desperate mission. Their first target, a massive Zorgon shipyard orbiting a gas giant. Matthew's voice crackled over the comms as they dropped out of hyperspace. Strike teams, you have your objectives. Hit fast, hit hard, and don't get bogged down. We're here to create chaos, not win a stand-up fight. Ceres led her team through the bowels of the shipyard's control center. Her fingers flew over alien keyboards, uploading viruses that sent security systems into overdrive. Defenses are down, she reported. You're clear to engage. Outside, Matthew's strike force descended on the shipyard like a swarm of angry hornets. Plasma cannons tore through half-finished Zorgon warships. Explosive charges detonated along fuel lines, setting off chain reactions that ripped through the structure. Zorgon defenders poured out of their barracks, mandibles clicking in fury. They charged headlong into the human and Lurian attackers, only to be cut down by precise bursts of weapons fire. A Zorgon commander, his carapace adorned with intricate markings, bellowed orders to his troops. Matthew locked eyes with the alien, raising his rifle. The two leaders clashed in a brutal melee. Matthew's combat knife sparked against the Zorgon's natural armor. He ducked under a sweeping claw, driving his blade up into a weak joint. The alien's death screech was cut short as Matthew fired point-blank into its face. Primary objective secured, Matthew panted into his comm. All units, fall back to extraction points. As quickly as they had arrived, the strike force melted away into the void of space, leaving destruction in their wake. Over the following weeks, Matthew's raiders struck again and again. They hit munitions depots, vaporizing stockpiles of Zorgon plasma weapons. Command centers went dark as Ceres' viruses wreaked havoc on their systems. Supply convoys disappeared without a trace, victims of Cade's ruthlessly efficient pirate tactics. But the victories came at a cost. After each raid, fewer ships returned to the rendezvous point. The faces of the survivors grew harder, more haunted. During one particularly vicious assault on a Zorgon fortress, Cade revealed his true colors. As Matthew's forces engaged the main Zorgon defenses, Cade's pirates turned their guns on their supposed allies. Sorry, Scotty. Cade's voice dripped with false sincerity over the comms. But there's too much loot here to pass up. Nothing personal, just business. Matthew cursed, ducking behind a fallen Zorgon walker as plasma bolts from both sides filled the air. He spotted Ceres pinned down nearby, her face a mask of concentration as she returned fire. Ceres, he shouted, on me! They fought their way through the chaos, covering each other's movements with practiced precision. A pirate lunged at Matthew with a vibroblade. He caught the man's wrist, twisting until bones snapped. Ceres put a plasma bolt through the screaming pirate's chest. Back to back, they held their ground against waves of Zorgons and traitorous humans alike. Matthew's rifle clicked empty. He snatched up a fallen Zorgon weapon, its alien configuration awkward in his hands but no less deadly. We need to get out of here, Ceres yelled over the din of battle. The charges are set. This whole place is gonna blow. Matthew nodded grimly. He keyed his emergency transponder, signaling the remaining loyal forces to extract. As they fought their way back to their shuttle, Matthew caught a glimpse of Cade's ship streaking away, its hold no doubt laden with stolen Zorgon tech. Another day, Vero, Matthew growled. I owe you one. The shuttle barely cleared the blast radius as the Zorgon fortress erupted in a massive fireball. Matthew sagged in his seat, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. He looked around at the battered remnants of his strike team, noting the empty seats where comrades should have been. As the weeks of relentless raiding stretched on, the toll became impossible to ignore. But slowly, surely, they began to see results. Zorgon communications grew frantic, then sporadic. Their once mighty armada fractured into disorganized pockets of resistance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of combat, Matthew gave the order to return to Lurian space. Their ships limped home, battle-scarred and weary, but victorious. On the observation deck of the Lurian flagship, Matthew and Ceres stood side by side, watching the swirling nebulae of the Lurian home system come into view. We did it, Ceres said softly. We bought them time. Matthew nodded, his expression solemn. We did, but at what cost? Ceres placed a hand on his arm, her touch a comfort after so much violence. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Matthew met her gaze, seeing the same mix of exhaustion and steel he felt in his own soul. They had won the battle, but the war was nowhere near the end. The Zorgons would return, and when they did, the fate of the entire galaxy would hang in the balance. The azure skies of the Lurian homeworld faded as Matthew Scott's strike force ascended into orbit. Matthew stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying holographic projections of the gathered fleet. Human and Lurian vessels clustered together, a patchwork armada united against the Zorgon threat. Final systems check complete, a Lurian technician reported. All ships ready for hyperspace jump. Matthew nodded, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. Commence Operation Thunderbolt. Space warped as the fleet vanished into hyperspace. Hours later, they emerged at the edge of a distant star system. Matthew's fingers danced across the command console, relaying encrypted orders to his stealth squadrons. Ceres, you're up, he said into the comm. Hit them hard and fast. Aboard her sleek infiltrator ship, Ceres acknowledged the order. Her team of elite hackers huddled around banks of alien computers, fingers flying across unfamiliar interfaces. Initiating cyber assault, Ceres announced. She plugged a data spike into the main terminal, unleashing a torrent of malicious code into the Zorgon network. Alarms blared across the Zorgon fleet as their systems went haywire. Sensor readings dissolved into static. Communication channels filled with gibberish. On the bridge of the Zorgon flagship, the new warlord raged at his subordinates. Find the source of this interference, he bellowed, his mandibles clicking furiously. As chaos engulfed the Zorgon armada, Matthew's main force dropped out of hyperspace. Human and Lurian warships opened fire, their weapons tearing into the disorganized alien fleet. Matthew gripped the controls of his heavily armored command ship, diving straight for the heart of the enemy formation. All gunners, fire at will. The space around them erupted in a firestorm of plasma bolts and energy beams. Matthew's vessel shuddered as return fire hammered its shields. He gritted his teeth, executing a series of evasive maneuvers that strained the ship's inertial dampeners to their limits. Warlord's flagship detected, a sensor officer called out. They're moving to engage. Matthew allowed himself a grim smile. Just as planned. Helm, bring us about. Let's give this bastard the fight he's looking for. The two massive ships closed on each other, their weapons blazing. Matthew's craft rocked violently as Zorgon energy beams sliced through its armor plating. He countered with a withering barrage from his main guns, watching with satisfaction as explosions blossomed across the enemy vessel's hull. Shields failing, an officer shouted over the din of battle. We can't take much more of this. Matthew's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. Prepare to jettison the warp core. On my mark. He waited, counting down the seconds as the Zorgon flagship loomed ever closer on his view screen. At the last possible moment, Matthew barked the order. Now! The warp core shot out from Matthew's ship, its antimatter containment field flickering. It streaked towards the Zorgon vessel, detonating in a blinding flash that tore through the alien craft's weakened defenses. As the enemy flagship began to burn up in the planet's atmosphere, Matthew received an urgent transmission from Ceres. We're going in, her voice crackled over the comm. Boarding the Zorgon command ship now. Ceres led her team of Lurian commandos through the burning wreckage of the Zorgon bridge. They moved with lethal precision, plasma rifles cutting down any alien crew that stood in their way. In the shattered remains of the command center, Ceres found herself face to face with the dying Zorgon warlord. The alien's eyes blazed with hatred as it lunged at her with its last ounce of strength. Ceres sidestepped the attack, bringing her rifle butt down hard on the warlord's skull. The alien collapsed in a heap at her feet. Command center secured, Ceres reported, her voice tight with adrenaline. She accessed the ship's main computer, transmitting the surrender codes to the remaining Zorgon vessels. All across the battlefield, Zorgon ships powered down their weapons. The remnants of their once mighty armada drifted helplessly in space, thoroughly defeated. Hours later, as rescue and salvage operations continued, Ceres found Matthew in the medical bay of the captured Zorgon flagship. He lay on a bed, covered in burns and lacerations, but very much alive. "Hell of a fight," Matthew said weakly as Ceres approached. She nodded, taking in the carnage around them. "We won," she said softly. "But at what cost?" Matthew's eyes met hers, reflecting the weight of all they had endured. "The cost of survival," he replied grimly, "and the price of becoming the very thing we set out to stop." Ceres sank into a chair beside him, feeling the full weight of their Pyrrhic victory settle onto her shoulders. As they drifted amid the wreckage of two shattered fleets, both human and alien, she wondered what new challenges awaited them in the vast, unforgiving expanse of space. Matthew stood on the bridge of the captured Zorgon flagship, his body still aching from the wounds of their last battle. Through the view screen, he watched as Lurian repair crews swarmed over the hulls of damaged ships, their work illuminated by the eerie glow of nearby nebulae. Ceres hunched over a console, her fingers dancing across alien controls as she integrated Zorgon systems with their own. "We've got incoming transmissions," she announced, her voice tight. "It's not good." Matthew leaned in, studying the intercepted Zorgon communiques. His eyes widened as he processed their contents. "They're rallying reinforcements. We need to act fast." He paced the bridge, formulating a plan. The crew watched him expectantly, tension thick in the air. Finally, Matthew turned to address them. "We use this ship as our Trojan horse," he declared. "We infiltrate Zorgon space and hit them where it hurts." The Lurian captain, Zalthor, clicked his mandibles nervously. "A bold strategy, but the risks are necessary," Matthew cut him off. "It's our only shot at ending this war before it spirals out of control." Over the following days, they prepared for their daring mission. Human and Lurian ships were carefully disguised amidst the wreckage of fallen Zorgon vessels. Ceres worked around the clock, reprogramming dead Zorgon ships to mimic life signs and create the illusion of a full battle group. As they approached Zorgon space, Matthew addressed the strike teams. "Stay sharp. One slip and we're done for." They pushed deeper into enemy territory, tensions rising with each parsec. Ceres monitored long-range scanners, her breath catching as Zorgon patrols passed dangerously close. "Patrol ship at 2 o'clock, she whispered. "Holding steady, they're hailing us." Matthew nodded, activating the comm system. A guttural Zorgon voice crackled through the speakers. Matthew responded with pre-recorded Zorgon phrases, his heart pounding as he prayed their ruse would hold. After an agonizing moment, the patrol moved on. Collective sighs of relief echoed through the bridge. Days stretched into weeks as they penetrated further into Zorgon space. Finally, they reached the frontier systems. Matthew gave the order, and all hell broke loose. Human and Lurian ships burst from their hiding places, weapons blazing. Ceres unleashed swarms of viral technopaths, overwhelming Zorgon defenses. Explosions blossomed across shipyards and orbital platforms as Matthew's forces struck with surgical precision. "Push forward," Matthew ordered as they smashed through the outer defenses. "Don't let up." He split their forces into specialized teams, each with its own objectives. Ceres led a squad to sabotage a massive Zorgon communications hub. They fought their way through twisting alien corridors, plasma bolts sizzling past their heads. Ceres ducked behind a console, returning fire as Zorgon defenders poured into the room. "Cover me," she shouted, pulling out a data spike. She jammed it into the main terminal, unleashing a torrent of destructive code. Alarms blared as systems crashed across the Zorgon network. Sensor arrays went dark, leaving the aliens blind and confused. Meanwhile, Matthew led the charge against a Zorgon fleet gathering to counterattack. His ships struck from multiple vectors, catching the enemy off guard. Zorgon vessels exploded in silent balls of fire, unable to coordinate an effective defense. As they pushed toward the Zorgon core worlds, resistance stiffened. Orbital defense platforms unleashed devastating barrages. Matthew's flagship shuddered under the assault, but he pressed on. "All ships concentrate fire on their command nexus," he ordered. A storm of weaponry converged on the massive structure. Its shields flickered and failed, and the nexus crumbled under the onslaught. With the path clear, Matthew enacted the final phase of his plan. He inputted the stolen command codes, overriding the core world's environmental systems. Atmosphere processors sputtered and died. Protective shield generators failed. Within hours, the once habitable Zorgon worlds became hostile wastelands. Surviving Zorgons fled in panic, their civilization collapsing around them. In the aftermath, Matthew stood on the bridge of his flagship, surveying the devastation they had wrought. The enormity of their victory settled over him like a heavy weight. Ceres approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "It's over," she said softly. "We actually did it." Matthew nodded grimly. "We did. Now comes the hard part, rebuilding from the ashes." Matthew stood frozen, his hands slick with Ceres' blood as the life drained from her eyes. The bridge fell silent, save for the soft hum of machinery and the ragged sound of his own breathing. "Sir," a junior officer approached cautiously, hand hovering near his sidearm, "you need to step away." Matthew barely registered the words. He stared at Ceres' lifeless form. Her final expression of betrayal seared into his mind. The gun lay discarded on the deck, a damning testament to his actions. Two security officers moved in, their boots echoing on the metal floor. They grasped Matthew's arms, pulling him away from Ceres' body. He offered no resistance, his limbs leaden with shock and grief. As they led him off the bridge, Matthew caught sight of his reflection in a darkened console screen. The face staring back at him was that of a stranger, haggard, haunted, with eyes devoid of the idealism that had once driven him. In the brig, Matthew sat on a hard metal bench, head in his hands. The cell's stark white walls seemed to close in around him, a fitting prison for the shell of a man he had become. Hours passed in a haze of self-recrimination. Matthew relived every decision, every compromise that had led him to this point. The countless lives sacrificed in the name of victory. Entire worlds rendered uninhabitable at his command. And now, Ceres, the one person who had stood by him through it all, dead by his own hand. A comm panel on the wall crackled to life. "Admiral Scott," a voice spoke, tinged with a mix of anger and disbelief. "The Lurian High Command demands an explanation for your actions." Matthew looked up, his voice hoarse as he replied, "There is no explanation, only consequences." He stood, approaching the cell's force field. Beyond it, he could see the vastness of space through a small viewport. The conquered Zorgan worlds hung there, silent testimony to humanity's triumph and to the price of that victory. As Matthew gazed out at the stars, he realized that in his quest to save humanity, he had lost sight of what made it worth saving. The man who had set out to be a hero had become the very monster he once fought against. The comm panel buzzed again. "A tribunal will convene to determine your fate, Admiral. May whatever gods you believe in have mercy on your soul." Matthew turned away from the viewport, facing the empty cell that now mirrored the emptiness within him. He had won the war, but at a cost beyond measure. As the reality of his actions settled over him like a suffocating shroud, Matthew Scott, once humanity's greatest champion, prepared to face judgment for the unforgivable sin born of his relentless pursuit of victory at any cost.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.